Wait for the slides here. My name is Erik Molvar. I'm the Executive Director of Western Watersheds Project, and I am a professional ecologist with studies on ecosystem effects of herbivory on Alaskan treeline ecosystems. But I've also done a lot of research into what happens all across the West because Western Watersheds Project specializes in the reform of the livestock industry and how to get back to healthy native ecosystems. And Point Reyes National Seashore is a public land that, as pointed out by one of our earlier speakers, has some really important California coastal prairies that are very important for biodiversity. And I would argue that the biodiversity crisis is one of two major crises that we are facing right now that we as humans must come to grips with. It's not just the climate crisis. The biodiversity crisis is every bit as important. And Point Reyes is known for a variety of different outstanding natural values, including the shorebirds, including the very rare snowy plover. We have the marine mammals that breed here. We have the magnificent Thule elk, which are the subject of a great deal of discussion and controversy today. And we have other species of wildlife. And these are lands that were designated by Congress essentially for Point Reyes National Seashore, established for purposes of public recreation, benefit, and inspiration, for Golden Gate National Recreation Area, established to preserve public use and enjoyment. So if you look at the statutory requirements that were set forth by Congress, you see a lot of public benefit, public enjoyment, public values. You don't see a lot of private use and enjoyment in this. And so you also don't see any mention of livestock in the purposes of these national seashores. So anyway, these were intended to be lands that were managed primarily for preservation, primarily for healthy natural landscapes. It's all very idyllic, but there were problems. And sometimes there were more than 6,000 cattle that were being run on commercial operations in Point Reyes National Seashore. And those cattle had impacts. The dairy operations liquefied manure from their operations and spread them all over the hilltops on the national seashore. This is unprecedented anywhere else in the national park system. There were manure avalanches that were so severe that at one point Representative Huffman suggested that the elephant seals should be moved from their natural breeding and brood rearing sites on the seashore to make way, because there were these toxic and environmentally destructive manure avalanches that were coming down onto the seashore. There were violations of the Clean Water Act, sometimes 30 times the legal limit of different species of bacteria. These had major effects on the ability of the public to safely use and enjoy the seashore areas. These water pollution plumes were going down into the lagoons where children were playing on the beach, causing a serious health safety hazard. And of course, there was the Thule elk situation, where we had the majority of Thule elk on Point Reyes National Seashore penned up on a relatively small peninsula that during drought years turned waterless. And then when these droughts occurred, the elk would die by the hundreds. And this is a photograph of an elk that died trying to get a drink in a pond that had dried up. And these elk were prevented from naturally dispersing to other parts of the national seashore where they could find forage, where they could find water, by this fence that was erected primarily to defend the ranchers from having to deal with competition for forage with the Thule elk, which are native to this area. And of course, there were the impacts of the livestock grazing itself. And here you see a dairy operation in Point Reyes National Seashore where the cattle have grazed the land down to bare dirt. And this rivals the overgrazing, the worst overgrazing that I have seen all across the Western United States. I've been to Nevada, I've been to Wyoming, I've been to Colorado. The Bureau of Land Management allows and permits overgrazing everywhere and authorizes it. This rivals the worst overgrazing that I've seen on those Bureau of Land Management lands. And in the wake of that kind of overgrazing, what comes back is invasive species of weeds. What you're looking at here, these kind of these clumps that look like almost like a cancer on the land, are milk thistle. That's a non-native invasive species, but the grasses in between them also are invasive species. Things like Italian ryegrass, European annual grasses that grow shallow-rooted for a short period in the springtime, brown off in the summer, and die entirely, giving up all their carbon back to the atmosphere. This is not sustainable from an environmental standpoint. This has converted the area of Point Reyes National Seashore that was dedicated into the so-called pastoral zone into basically 100% invasive weeds. The California coastal grasslands were entirely destroyed and displaced. So my organization and two others filed suit back in 2016. And when I came in with Western Watersheds Project, one of my first tasks when I came in the door was there were settlement talks over the first lawsuit that we brought. And we brought a lawsuit that said that the Park Service had failed to create a new general management plan in a timely fashion, which was true. They had issued livestock leases without creating any environmental review or looking at the environmental impacts. They had livestock grazing that fundamentally violated the Park Service Organic Act and the Point Reyes Act, in addition to federal regulations. This is what we alleged in our first lawsuit. And we signed a settlement. And the settlement basically said the Park Service must create a general management plan, and they must consider at least one alternative where they end commercial livestock grazing on Point Reyes National Seashore. This came to be known as Alternative F. And when the National Park Service went through its general management plan process, they asked for public comment, and 6,900 odd people commented on the Point Reyes National Seashore Plan. 91.4% of the public comments opposed further ranching on Point Reyes National Seashore, and of those comments which specified which alternative they preferred for their park, 94.2% of them recommended that the Park Service adopt Alternative F, the alternative that would end livestock grazing forever on Point Reyes National Seashore. So that was what the public wanted. Then, of course, in 2021, the Harvard Animal Law Clinic filed a lawsuit challenging the elk fence and the confinement of Thule elk on Point Reyes, on Tomales Point, on the basis that they had failed to revise their management plan, on the basis that they had failed to revise their elk management plan, and the failure to provide adequate water and forage. That lawsuit was unsuccessful at the district court level, but was under appeal during the time when all of the other activities that we're going to be talking about today have taken place. And then my organization, together with the Resource Renewal Institute, Center for Biological Diversity, and represented by Advocates for the West, filed another lawsuit against the new general management plan because the Park Service had doubled down on ranching, not only offering 20-year leases for further livestock everywhere where there was livestock grazing on the park, but also expanding the number of allowable uses. So we filed suit, and we argued that authorizing this livestock grazing violates the fundamental statutes for which these parks were authorized, that the Park Service failed to take a hard look at the impacts of the various ranching activities on the Thule elk, and that the new general management plan authorized levels of livestock grazing that were violating the Clean Water Act. And then during the course of this process, as the litigation proceeded, the California Coastal Commission had a process of its own, and it basically decided that the ranching operations on Point Reyes National Seashore would indeed be subject to the water quality standards that the state manages for. That put a lot of pressure on the livestock operations that up to this point had been violating those Clean Water Act standards. And so ultimately in 2024, in December of last year, the Park Service decided in a separate decision to take down the Thule elk fence. That took care of the Thule elk issues in some respects. And then in January of this year, my organization and the ranchers and the National Park Service, together with the Nature Conservancy, which was brought in because they had money for buyouts for certain members of the ranching community, we all signed an agreement saying we're going to end this litigation with a settlement. And the ranchers got a pretty good deal. The ranchers that stayed got 20-year leases and they got expanded uses. So they are better off today than they were before the lawsuit. The ranchers that took the buyouts got multi-million-dollar payouts pooled amongst them. I don't know how much any of these ranchers got individually. My organization has a wing called the Sagebrush Fund that does buy out ranchers. Just doing some basic math, these seem like really generous amounts of money that these ranchers are getting, probably more than the Sagebrush Fund would authorize. The environmental groups get to dismiss our lawsuit with prejudice, which means that we don't get to bring those claims against this decision once again. We forswear the option to litigate against this particular general management plan. On the other hand, if there are amendments to this general management plan or further actions, we remain free to litigate those. Then we are able to litigate future leases that are issued. And then at the same time, the Park Service put out a new general management plan, which is radically different than their 2021 version. And in that general management plan, 12 of the 14 ranches will retire, take buyouts, and leave the national seashore. Dairying ends forever on Point Reyes National Seashore. The departing ranches are converted to a scenic landscape zone, and that scenic landscape zone has an allowable targeted grazing that can occur under the Nature Conservancy or somebody else that's in the nonprofit sector, but it can't be commercial grazing. And Grayton Rancheria can get some influence over what happens next, including potentially tribal burning. On the left, you see the number of ranches that were active. The dairies are in light tan. The dark tan is beef ranches before the litigation and before the settlement. To the right, you see those purple areas are the scenic landscape zone. After those ranches will depart. So now you see that most of Point Reyes National Seashore will be managed for scenic landscape. Most of Golden Gate National Recreation Area will continue to be allowable for commercial livestock grazing. Now the Tule elk actually get primacy over cattle on Point Reyes National Seashore. They're the first consideration. And what we want to see is we want to see a return to the natural order of things, where it's the Tule elk and the tribal burning that maintain the coastal grasslands. And we want to see the restoration of those coastal grasslands everywhere throughout the national seashore, such that not only do we have these tiny little pockets of surviving native ecosystems, but we have healthy native ecosystems restored throughout the entire park. Thank you.